So ani bojo kinawia, no the indigenous cause, Sawikwemikong, Minowa, and Swakamak and Donjiba, Anishinaabe a King Donji, Nemedo Dam, Anishinaabe and Dow, Kinamagan, Minowash, Gabeos and Dow, Nisimdanash and Nanin, the Sabonigus, OCSB and Donoki, and Gichinanda Mabaminan. So hello everyone, my name is Josh Lewis. My Anishinaabe name is Nodin, which means wind in Anishinaabe Moan. And that's the language that I just shared with you. My family comes from Ukwemikong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, and I've been here on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory for the last 10 years. My role is the cultural advisor here at the Ottawa Catholic School Board. I also shared that I'm part of the Sturgeon clan, and I also shared that I'm 35 winters old. I think it's really important and very customary for Indigenous people to share where we're from because it kind of lets you know a little bit more about us and who we are. So for me, I've always grown up as an Indigenous person in the urban setting, but I also had close connections to my reserve. I was able to spend time with my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and I'd always hear the language. I'd always be around family gatherings when I was a kid. But being in the city, when I'd leave the reserve, which was 2 hours away, there was always that disconnection. With being an urban Indigenous person also comes a lot of privileges and opportunities. And so I do acknowledge those in my day-to-day life, and that's who I am. So having done a lot of work here in the city as an adult, I have worked a lot with Indigenous youth and children. A lot of the times we share similar stories, and I really wanted to talk about my childhood because it's a really important part of how I came to be who I am today. And I think the people that raised me were amazing people. They're Anishinaabe, Kwe, Indigenous women who taught me a lot about how to be a good person. But at the same time, those women did struggle because they did experience their own forms of colonialism when they were forced to be in residential schools as well as Indian day schools. Those women in my life, they were taught to be ashamed of themselves. I know for the most part, they are very proud of who they are. There's pieces of that always stuck with them. And so growing up, those kind of pieces of shame were kind of passed down to me, and that's called intergenerational trauma. It's kind of a term that is used to explain how traumas are passed down. And it's not necessarily that it's something that I wanted to accept, but it's just part of that process of when someone experiences something traumatic, they pass it down. And so for me as a young person, knowing that my family had experienced that, I did carry some of that shame growing up. Growing up in poverty, experienced going to food banks, I experienced living in native housing, being in a single parent home. I didn't grow up with my father in my life, so I think that was a big part of my life that I lost that opportunity to really understand how to be a healthy male. It really made my life a lot more challenging, as well as being disconnected culturally from my identity, my Indigenous identity. And for any person, again, being in the city, when you're disconnected from that, you do lose a part of your culture, you do lose a part of your identity. I was always kind of looking to learn more about who I am. What does it mean to be Indigenous? What does it mean to be Anishinaabe? And so I think that's kind of what started my journey into wanting to learn more about that. A big change in my life was when I became a brother. It was just me and my mom for most of my life. And it wasn't until when I was 10 years old that I started coming into a bigger family. I had to become a role model. I had to become sort of like a second parent, even though I was 10 years old. That's where I learned a lot about responsibility. That's where I learned a lot about having to be there for people in my life. It's not necessarily something that I learned from a father figure, but it's something I had to learn on the go just because I knew that my mom needed that support. And so at that time, I began working. I began helping provide for them. And I think that's very common with many Indigenous youth is that we have to take care of our siblings. We're always looking out for our family members, whether it's our cousins or our siblings. And I've always known that there's more to life than just myself, and there's a bigger purpose. A big question that I often get asked is, why do I do this work in regards to cultural advocacy and support? In my family, I learned that my grandmother was a teacher for many years and I had other relatives that were teachers. And so for me, I kind of just followed that path. I always just had this calling to kind of go into it. And so when I graduated high school, I went into teachers college. In my first few years of school, I took religious studies. Being disconnected from the reserve, I always, again, was wanting to learn more about who I was and what that meant to be Indigenous. And they taught me a little bit about different religions in the world, but it was a friend that kind of told me to take an Indigenous studies course. I was kind of apprehensive at first because I wasn't too sure if I was ready for something like that at the time of my life. And it was the first time that I actually had an Indigenous teacher. And my teacher was Anishinaabe, and he was this really amazing person that kind of opened the door for me and allowed me to come into his classroom to learn all the things that I've been wanting to learn for such a long time. After that, I changed my major from religious studies to Indigenous studies. I was completely immersed in Indigenous teachings from many Indigenous teachers who taught me about history, language, cultures, health, things like that. I was really lucky in my last year of Teachers College to have a mentor by the name of Pamela Toulouse, who was a well-known Indigenous educator who was my mentor. And she taught me so much, kind of took me under her wing. And that's kind of how we learn in Indigenous communities, is we kind of teach each other through practice. During that time though, I lost a few family members very tragically. I saw how it affected my mother, how it affected my grandmother, my aunties. It affected me in many different ways. And during that time, I found that I kind of started to make unhealthy choices for myself and really kind of led a lifestyle that I'm not really proud of. There's a lot of years that I struggled, but through that all, I was able to continue on and graduate. When I graduated, I had this diploma that said, hey, Josh Lewis, Indigenous Education. I was still missing something. Even though I got all this academic education, I still knew that there was more I needed to learn. I just decided to go work in community. Many people, when they graduate, they go right into the career field, in the sense of as an educator, they get right into the schools. But for me, I really wanted to continue learning from my people. I started off working with toddlers, and then I worked a lot with single parents. And then I also traveled out to Australia for a short time, and I taught definitely like students that kind of had rough backgrounds, I guess you could say. And so when I was in Australia, I found that I was trying to get away from something. I think it was one day I realized that I ran out of like sage. I ran out of medicine. And then I said to myself, how am I gonna get medicine here? And I really felt far away from home at that time. And so what I decided to do was come back to these lands, my homelands, and I moved to Ottawa to work with Indigenous youth. During this time, I also met my wife, and that's kind of started a really beautiful part of my life that allowed me to just continue to grow as a person and just kind of learning how to be a healthy Indigenous man. Once I moved here to Ottawa, I was able to begin working in community. And I started off working at the Friendship Center, and that's often what happens when people move from a new city, is they connect at the local Friendship Center and they make connections. And from there, I started working with youth, but then I also started working for a short time with the homeless community. So again, I had this big understanding of what a lot of our people are facing in so many different aspects. From there, I worked at the Wabano Center. I also worked with Nunavut Sivuniksavut, which is an Inuit college. And I got to tutor students there and learn a lot about Inuit culture as well. And then I also took on a role as a support coordinator for Indigenous students at the Ottawa Public School Board. I always just wanted to be a healthy role model and offer support to students so that they can see themselves, so that they can feel comfortable in their own skin and they can actually know an Indigenous person. So coming into the Ottawa Catholic School Board, in this role I'm able to work with students, but then also connect with teachers, principals, superintendents, work with folks in the school board system, as well as connect with community as well. I don't know everything, I'm still learning, but I know enough that I can help and support a lot of folks that are trying to do Indigenous education in a good way. A lot of people I've met through this role I know have really good hearts and really are doing this work in a good way. Right now I'm supporting a lot of students, trying to give them cool opportunities, working with their family and student support workers, and also collaborating with the Indigenous education team here, as well as the religious department and all the folks in the learning and parent engagement department. As a cultural advisor, I'm really trying my best to open the doors for folks, to allow Indigenous students to understand who they are a little bit more. And maybe some of you that are watching who are Indigenous. Because there was a time in my life where I really needed that. I know how really important that is, how crucial that is. So I think it's really important when working with Indigenous people that their stories are very complex, quite like mine. Indigenous people are, again, coming from reserves, they're coming from northern communities. Some of them have always been in cities. Some people are more connected to their language, some are not. Some have been through very traumatic experiences and some haven't. We all have different stories that we carry, but they're all so important, they're so valuable. So when I work with Indigenous youth, when I work with parents, when I work with families, I try my best to just hear them out and understand where they're coming from. And I understand that the very complex history of Indigenous people here in Canada the very traumatic experiences that we've kind of collectively been through. So I think it's really important to get to know folks, take that time to understand their story. You ask them how they got there. You can't judge a book by the cover, or sometimes you don't know what people have been through just based on a first interaction with them. In the work that I do, that I try my best to be open and understanding, and so I hope that you can also do that. I'm very grateful in this role that I've been able to learn from a lot of the colleagues that I have about their backgrounds too. As sometimes it's different than mine, but at the same time there's a lot of connections. And I think that's how we best connect with each other, is through experiences that we've had. And I hope that my story was able to invite you in to understand the life of one Indigenous person. And so it's really important that you get to know the Indigenous people in your classroom, because you're always going to meet Indigenous people no matter where you go in this country. Just know there's Indigenous people all over this country. And it's really important not to have one lens on who they are. Turtle Island is what they call this place. And Indigenous people have been here for thousands of years, whereas Canada has only been around for 100 and something years. So there's a lot of rich history here. There's a lot of languages that have been here. They're ancient languages that have been passed down from generation to generation. So it's really important to understand the land that you're on, to understand the people that you're talking to and working with, that they have been here for a long time. So I want to say Chimigwech. That means thank you very much in my language, Anishinaabe Moen. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to understand a little bit about who I am. And I just hope that you continue learning, continue talking to Indigenous people, getting to know them, because there's so much that we have to offer and there's so much that we want to share with people. And I hope that I get to connect with some of you who are watching this video today.